How much of the food at the grocery store do you imagine is the product of gene splicing in a laboratory? It may surprise you that up to 70% of the processed food in your market contains products of genetic engineering, including soft drinks, ketchup, potato chips, cookies, ice cream, cornflakes, to name a few. Genes, of course, are the building blocks of DNA, the blueprint of life. You have the same DNA as a redwood tree. The difference is in the genes. Each gene expresses a trait, say tallness in the redwood or brown eyes in a child. 6 years ago, science began plucking individual genes and splicing them into our food crops. Now, Americans are beginning to ask, what is genetic engineering? Is it healthy? In short, what have they done to our food? We start with a fish story. These salmon are going to make history. They're due to be the first genetically engineered animal approved to eat. They're the invention of a company run by Elliot Intis.
You know, to my mind, salmon seems okay. Why did you engineer a new one?
Well, it's not that the existing salmon aren't okay. They are. The problem is that we have to feed ever-increasing numbers of people in the world today.
Intis grew up in Boston knowing one thing. He would never go into the fish business like his father. But then he'd never met a fish like this. Watch what happens when the scales hit the scales.
2.54.
That's a normal salmon, about 1 year old. This is a bioengineered salmon, also 1 year old and more than 3 times larger.
9.14.
They grow faster. They get to their full adult size in roughly half the time that they otherwise would.
Again, this is a normal fish, and this is Intis's fish. His super salmon were created by splicing in genetic material from 2 other fish, an ocean pout and a Pacific salmon. Intis says the result is a salmon just like any other, except for its remarkable ability to grow. In the beginning, they expected to increase the growth rate 25%. They got 400%. Intis says it's a miracle of science. With the genes of 2 fishes, he can feed a multitude.
You know what your critics say. They say you're messing around in the genome, and you couldn't possibly predict what all of the outcomes are going to be.
Well, let me agree with some of my critics. We are indeed messing with the genome. This is an old human tradition. First started 10,000 years ago when we first began to cross-pollinate crops and to breed mutant monsters such as wheat, which is a hybrid of 3 separate grass species.
When you crossbreed, you're changing the genome gradually over time. But when you do it in the laboratory, you're creating a new organism like that.
I can't argue against the fact that modern methods of biotechnology are more powerful. I mean, we can do things with modern methods of biotech that could not easily be done, or perhaps not even at all, through standard crossbreeding. But that's the advantage. That's where we have to look at what is the product and not the process.
Genetically engineered food is really a revolution, whether you love it or hate it. It's a revolution in food.
Andrew Kimbrell is a lawyer who runs a consumer advocate group called the Center for Food Safety. He says consumers have no idea how much science is changing our food.
You're taking a gene from a foreign species, let's take a flounder gene, for example, and putting it into a tomato. This has actually happened.
They've taken a flounder gene and put it in a tomato?
Right, because they want the tomato to grow at lower temperatures, and they also want to be able to store it in freezing for a much longer time than they currently can do.
And a fish gene helps a tomato do that?
That's right.
It's all in this U.S. Department of Agriculture permit, which okayed the experimental gene based on one identified in the winter flounder. The idea was that the gene that keeps flounders from freezing in cold water could also keep the tomato fresh in freezing weather. The tomatoes were grown, but never sold. Still, Kimbrell says it shows that food is changing in ways that we do not expect.
We're able to, through this technology, mix and match the genetic code of the entire living kingdom at will. We've never had this power before.
Nowhere is that power being put to more use than this laboratory outside St. Louis. Those are greenhouses on the roof, sheltering plants the likes of which the world has never seen.
In a given year in this building, how many new plants do you engineer?
My estimate would be tens of thousands of plants produced each year.
Look, this one says wheat transformation.
That's right.
Eric Sachs is a scientist at Monsanto. After 100 years of making chemicals, Monsanto is now betting its future on biotech. The company is devoting all of its research to inventing new plants. They have perfected a family of crops that contain a natural pesticide. Monsanto plucked a gene from a type of bacteria, a gene that happens to be lethal to bugs. They spliced that gene into corn, potatoes, and cotton. This cotton, for example, was exposed to bollworms. The worms are feasting on a normal plant, but Monsanto's bioengineered cotton is clean.
This is strictly the result, you're telling me, of the genetic engineering.
When the bugs bite, they're finished.
The pests basically have died.
Because the plant killed them.
Bioengineered plants have been on the market for 6 years. The bug-killing corn and potatoes are in products you probably buy and eat every week. In fact, the bioengineered corn now makes up 25% of the nation's corn harvest. If you think you don't want a bacteria gene in your corn, Monsanto's Scottish Chief Operating Officer Hugh Grant says think of the benefits.
There's millions of gallons of insecticide that hasn't been used since these crops were launched. Today, there are hundreds of millions of acres of these crops grown, not just here in the US, but increasingly around the world.
At Monsanto, new plants are created here with a very simple trick.
We can actually start...
They use a chemical to clip out the gene they want to transfer. Then that new gene is carried into the plant's DNA by a type of bacteria that have a natural habit of invading plant cells with genetic material.
And how long does that take for the bacterium to change the cotton plant?
We allow this to incubate about a day.
Do we understand what we're doing? When we're mucking about with the DNA and moving genes from one plant into another, do we really know what we're doing with a certainty?
There is a very high degree of certainty in this area. It's very, very specific. And the fascinating thing is, as the technology has developed, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years, the degree of certainty increases tremendously as well.
But there is much less certainty overseas.
There have already been several arrests for criminal damage.
In Europe, biotech food is protested in the fields and in the streets. Many grocery stores and restaurants refuse to sell it. In Japan, protesters are up in arms over whether biotech corn pollen is poisonous to butterflies, something that our EPA calls a minimal concern. All of this is a tempest in a test tube that you can trace, in part, to a 70-year-old Hungarian biochemist with a fondness for bow ties.
Thank you very much, very kind.
Arpad Pusztai is a respected scientist and a blight on the flowering ambition of the biotech industry.
Based on the research that you have done, do you think genetically modified foods have moved into the marketplace much too quickly?
Far, far too quickly. Doing the experiments.
Pusztai is still lecturing audiences about his 3-year study funded by the British government. His experiment fed rats both normal potatoes and bioengineered potatoes.
You didn't expect to see any difference between the regular potatoes and the genetically modified potatoes?
None whatsoever.
You were surprised?
Oh, absolutely shattered. Now you can see it.
Pusztai says the rats that ate the genetically engineered potatoes suffered unusual thickening of the lining of the stomach and intestine and a weakening of the immune system. Part of his work was published by a respected medical journal, The Lancet. But some scientists have criticized Pusztai's methods, and other studies have found that bioengineered food is safe.
Doctor, dozens and dozens of genetically modified products are on grocery store shelves in the United States.
Yeah.
Virtually everyone in this country is eating some genetically modified food.
Well, I think that we don't know what are the consequences of that. That the effects will be long-term effects.